Hello and welcome to our Teaching for 21st Century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glasshoff Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. If you do have any questions, please put them on the Q&A box you see on your screen. And tonight, our very special guest is Mark Dury. He's the author of the book, The Qur'an and its Biblical Reflexes. Hi, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We are all excited to hear all your thoughts on this very, very, very important topic. So, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's great to be sharing some thoughts with you about one of the most important and influential books in the history of humankind. The Quran is not an easy read. It's not an easy document to understand. And when people read the Quran for 1400 years, or say 1200 years, they've been very dependent on having a backstory to it, a context for interpreting the Quran. And that backstory has been provided by the biography of Muhammad, the life of Muhammad. But scholars have been finding that that backstory often doesn't match the text of the Quran as well as it should. There are inconsistencies, and there are things about the Quran that the backstory just can't explain or would seem to get wrong. And one of the challenges for Islam is that that backstory was recorded and put together 150 to 300 years after the Quran itself. So that's like trying to create a context for the American Civil War now, and reconstructing that now. There isn't enough contemporary context to make sense of the Quran at the time it was produced. What are the problems with the backstory? What are the puzzles about the Quran that the story doesn't really account for? Well, there's a whole host of issues actually, and I'll only mention some of them. But for me, perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence was put together by a scholar, Patricia Kroner, and she wrote this brilliant article, How Did the Quranic Pagans Make Their Living? So she asked the question, if you were studying the Quran and asking what sort of community is this speaking to, and you look at the evidence that speaks about how the listeners to the recitations of the Quran, how they were making a living, you can build up a picture of their life. And the picture that's built up is of an agricultural community. It's a farming community. It's a community that grows grain, that has cattle, and there are olive trees and pomegranates, and there are streams, and the Quran invites the audience to feast their eyes on the luscious fruits and the crops and the verdant foliage that they can see. Now, this is a real puzzle because in Mecca, it's impossible to grow all these crops that are described. And Mecca wasn't even an oasis. An oasis is a place with a spring. It has a source of water. In Mecca, all there was a well with a very limited capacity in the middle of a desert valley. So it's absolutely impossible that there could have been a town, a town folk, which the Quran speaks about this town, of people that were growing crops in the way that's described in the Quran. The climate is too hot. The olives couldn't set fruit because it's not cold enough there. There's lots of issues so if you were just reading the Quran without any knowledge of its context and where it came from, you would never have imagined that this could have been produced in Mecca because it just doesn't fit the climate. But there are other issues as well with the location in the Quran. So the Quran says to the audience that they walk past the ruins of Lot's people in the afternoon. So the place where the story of Sodom and Gomorrah happened, of Lot's people, supposedly was within walking distance of this community. And that's amazing because it's 800 miles away from Mecca. And also there are references to a series of Arab tribes or communities, towns in the Quran, and it mentions them by name. And we know these to be well to the north of Mecca and Medina. And it also mentions Lot's people, and it says, of these, Lot's people are the nearest to you. So this indicates that community should have been even further to the north than all those places that are mentioned in the northern part of Arabia, and absolutely the opposite direction in a way to where Mecca and Medina are. And it also mentions some battles, big battles between the Byzantines and the Persians, and it says that they're in the place nearest to you. But the only place those battles could be that's referring to in the area of Jerusalem and Damascus. Again, that just doesn't make sense. The geography is all wrong, and there's a lot of other smaller problems, but absolutely the biggest one is that the Meccans could not have made their living in Mecca, the so-called Meccans. There's another piece of evidence that occurred to me when I was thinking about this that suggests that geography is wrong, and that is the theology of the Qur'an. In the first part of the Qur'an, the so-called Meccan surahs or Meccan chapters, there is a great focus on the doomsday scenario, you might say. That is, the messenger who's delivering these recitations to his community is warning the people that if they don't repent, if they don't accept his message, there will be a terrible judgment from God. And this judgment could come in the form, as it has in the past, he says, of earthquakes or fire from heaven or floods or thunderbolts. And he keeps mentioning this, the story after story of cities, tribes, peoples that were destroyed. And he keeps saying there are, in fact, you can see the ruins of the townships around you of these peoples that have been destroyed. That's another problem with the Mecca story, by the way. There's not even evidence for a town in Mecca at the time of Muhammad, let alone ruins of towns around Mecca. So the whole message of that first part of the Quran is repent or perish. It's a kind of a penny story, or the Chicken Little, I think you call it in the United States. The sky is falling, so you've got to do something about it. Now, here's the thing about the geography is that message that the wrath of God is going to fall upon you and destroy you, and you've seen this happen in the past, doesn't really make much sense in Mecca or Medina. The Arabian Plate, as it's called, is the most stable, tectonically stable area in the Middle East. It's the least earthquake-prone area in the Middle East. But if you were to preach a doomsday scenario message and build up a kind of doomsday cult around this message, which is what is described in the Quran, you wouldn't be doing it in that area. You'd be doing it in an area where people had experienced those kinds of terrible destructions in the past. I mean, if you were preaching, warning the world today about a global pandemic, people would be paying attention and they would find your warnings credible. But if they'd never experienced it, they would just dismiss it and be unprepared. And we've seen that's what's happened. And in fact, further to the north in the southern Levant, there'd been a whole series of catastrophic earthquakes. They'd had tsunamis that had killed thousands of people. There are reports of large areas where township after township was destroyed and vacant for considerable periods of time. And this was massive, and the century or two just before the Quran was one of the worst periods, and it's well documented. So, and there also, when these earthquakes come, you'd get cities burning up because of the effect of the earthquake triggering off fires. So a lot of what the Quran describes would make a lot of sense in the southern Levant. That would be a place that you'd preach that message. So that theology of this doomsday scenario doesn't fit the context of Mecca and Medina. Another area which is really interesting, and I think the jury's still out on that, is the question of what dialect the Quran was actually written in. If you study Arabic, you'll realize that Arabic is not so much pronounced as written, but it's interpreted through the help of dots and dashes that in a way change sometimes what the consonant letters actually say. And I think it's pretty clear that the way the Quran is pronounced today is not the way it was originally pronounced when it was first recited. And it raises the question of what was the dialect of Arabic that it was recited in. Until recently, the only real information we had about Arabic dialects was really from later sources. Muslims looked for the dialect of the Quran for a few centuries and they could never find it. They found signs of it everywhere, and some even said it was revealed in many dialects. But in the last few decades, scholars have done an amazing work, particularly one scholar called Ahmad al-Jalal. amazing work reconstructing early Arabic dialects, pre-Quranic dialects, based on rock inscriptions. There are thousands and thousands of graffiti on rocks all over the Middle East. And Al-Jalat's even written a grammar of one particular regional dialect that would have been spoken before the Quran. And he studied the Arabic, for example, in the southern Levant, just in the centuries before the Quran, mostly written in Greek letters. And so we're getting closer to being able to get an answer to that question: what was the dialect of the Quran? I mean, I'm beginning to work on it, and I can see some evidences that the Quran was not written in the dialect of what was later the Hijazi dialect, the dialect of Mecca. And in fact, European scholars came to the conclusion in the middle of the 20th century that it couldn't have been the dialect of Mecca and Medina that the Quran was written in. So that's an area that's still developing. It's a really interesting question, and it's an exciting time really for Quranic studies. I want to move on to the second part of my presentation. I've been speaking about the problems with the geography of the Quran. There's also a problem, a mismatch between the backstory of Islamic tradition and the internal dynamics of the Quran, the story the Quran is telling. And particularly, there's a mismatch in the account of what changed in the middle of the Quran, because it's absolutely clear that the Quran is in two parts. There's the surahs that are sometimes usually called Meccan surahs, and then there's the so-called Medinan surahs. And there's some sort of crisis that triggers a change between these two parts. And the traditional story is that the community around the messenger Muhammad was persecuted in Mecca. As a result of that persecution, they fled to Medina, where they found allies, and they established a state, and they became powerful and victorious through military might. So they went from being victims to victors. So that's the kind of explanation for the change. For example, the shift to violence is explained through that. The problem with that story is that it doesn't actually fit the text as well as it should, or as well as it could. And I looked at the Quran and said, if you were going to ask this question, what happened, what caused this major transition, which has many different effects in the text of the Quran, stylistic and in its meaning as well. And I came up with a really different explanation, different from the official backstory. And it's a theological explanation. The crisis was not so much a crisis of persecution as a crisis of theological credibility. So this is the story. The Meccan surahs are in a stage where the messenger is preaching an act of God to destroy disbelievers, and people should repent and follow these messengers, the message. The problem is that as time passes, and this is very, very clear in those surahs, the disbelievers who wouldn't accept this message get more and more skeptical, and they begin to mock the messenger, and they mock the community, and it gets very difficult. And even the messenger, it says, begins to doubt and gets anxious and is depressed. And the followers of the messenger, the early Muslims, they also are under a lot of psychological pressure. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, because the messenger is saying, you're going to, disbelievers will be destroyed, and the disbelievers are saying, oh, that's funny, when's that going to happen? Bring on what you promise, they say to the messenger. When's it? Hello, Muhammad, or the messenger today? Has it happened yet? Is it going to be tomorrow? And the pressure, it really gets very considerable. And I would say those late Meccan surahs are obsessed with this issue. And what is about to happen in the theological dynamics of that community is it's about to fall apart, because you can't be a doomsday prophet forever. At some point, doomsday should come, or else you become a laughing stock, really. It doesn't hold. So the messenger keeps responding through the words of the Quran, saying, be patient, I'm just a messenger, I just deliver the message. It's not up to me when it happens, that's up to God, and be patient. It's always been like this in the past with other messengers. And then there's this creates a crisis. I call it an eschatological crisis in my book, which has just come out in paperback, by the way. So that's a good thing if you want to buy it, because it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. But I call it an eschatological crisis because it's a kind of doomsday coming now, and it's not coming, and there's a problem. Well, the crisis is resolved. The theology of this group is saved from mockery, and it's resolved by violence. So even though the messenger had been preaching about acts of God like earthquakes and fire from heaven and thunderbolts as the means of destruction, what happens is that there's the revelation that the believers should take up their swords and their spears, and this is the act of God on the disbelievers. And so there seems to be some fighting that happens, and then this is interpreted as God's hand. So the Quran says that, you know, Allah killed them by your hands. You didn't throw the spears, Allah threw the spears. And the vindication of this doomsday prophecy is the violence of the believers. This causes some theological problems in the Quran, because up until that point, the messenger had been saying, I'm just a messenger. That's all I do is to deliver the message. You know, I'm not responsible for this outcome. Just wait and you'll see. But then there's a shift, and the problem is the messenger has always, up until this point, insisted that Allah never changes in the way he deals with messengers and with prophets. You'll never see a change in the sunnah, the way of Allah, he says, with messengers, which implies that he's just patiently waiting for the same thing that's happened in the past, an earthquake or something like that. But in this case, it's an incredible act of activism that brings in the hand of God. That is, the believers go to war. This is the problem, because that hadn't been anticipated in the previous prophecies, in the previous surahs. So at that point, the messenger begins to tell stories about past messengers who were violent. So he speaks about prophets who fought, and he speaks of Moses and Jesus as a kind of jihadis promoting martyrdom in the path of Allah. So he has to change the story of the messengers in order to retrieve this principle that the way of Allah never changes. He said he's no longer saying in that second part of the Quran that I'm just a messenger who delivers the message. That is gone, and he instead he becomes the one who speaks for God and commands with the force of God. And there's a fundamental shift in the community's understanding of prophecy and of the whole status of the messenger. So I think the point I want to make is that the traditional story, victims to victors, persecuted to dominant force, I think it looks like an attempt to understand the Quran. Like, it looks like an attempt to explain the Quran after the fact. And it only does so at the expense of downplaying a lot of the text of the Quran, particularly this crisis, this theological crisis. And in my understanding of the Quran itself, the theological explanation for that transition makes much more sense. It accounts for the text much more comprehensively, explains a great deal of the text, much more than that other explanation does. And it's a really interesting thing, I think, for further research to ask, to what extent is that backstory that I've suggested, which I think is what the Quran is actually about, to what extent is that suppressed and erased in the biographies and the hadiths and the traditions that were developed centuries later? Well, this is a really exciting and fascinating period in the history of scholarship of the Quran. You've got scholars working on many manuscripts, which have a lot of variation. You've got this interesting work being done on the Arabic dialects using data that was never available before. And I think you've got people who are increasingly committed to read the Quran in its own terms. It's raising lots of questions. It's an exciting time intellectually to be asking these questions. It's troubling too, I think, for Islam and for Muslim scholars. There's a period really, in a sense, in which Islam is facing challenges which Christianity had to face centuries ago of critical scholarship. But there's some reasons why I think the Quran has a hidden story. It's an interesting story, but it's not the traditional story. It's not the backstory that Islam has provided, and it's not the backstory of faith that's at the heart of Islam. It's a different story. It's a story about a community of believers, a kind of doomsday cult that was much further to the north than Mecca and Medina, that almost crashed due to the non-arrival of the act of God, and which rescued itself through violence as the implementation, the fulfillment of these prophecies. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Absolutely. You obviously pointed a lot of great points and a lot of profound details, but I just love how at the very end you brought up the, the prophecy never arrived. That's why within the ex-Muslim community, at least, we always say Muhammad, the prophet with no prophecy. He failed to deliver for sure. While we're waiting for your question to come in, if you don't mind me asking one question, as you were saying, the verses that are referred to as Meccan and Medinan, would it be safe to say that gradually and very quickly, as Medinan verses started to come in, the point of Quran changed from a religion guideline into an actual what is convenient for the Prophet of Islam?
I think there is an element of that. So as long as the messenger, which is the preferred term the Quran uses of him, as long as the messenger was saying, I'm just a messenger, I'm not responsible for this, I'm not a commander, I don't organize these things, that's God's business, I'm just delivering this and it's up to you to make it. As long as he was saying that, then he was a little bit more like the old idea of a prophet. He could just speak from God and off he'd go and leave people to figure out what they should do about it. But after the transition, when the fighting becomes the hand of God, he begins to take on a lot of other characteristics. So he becomes very detailed in the commands he gives to people in their lives. There's a lot more direction. There's also, it's really strikingly, there's a lot of instructions about how to relate to him, how you shouldn't approach him, how you should approach him. People shouldn't be rude to him, they should, approach him in this way. It's quite striking, actually. It becomes fairly controlling. And also, these statements, if Allah and the messenger have decided an affair, it's not up to the believer to have an opinion. This joining of Allah and the messenger as if they were one person, that happens in the latter part. So the messenger in a way speaks for God and begins to be the commander of people's lives, and is a lot of the rules, the laws come in later as well. I mean, the first part of the Quran is basically about, fasting, praying, believing, repenting. But in the second part, you get all these detailed instructions for women and there's also the regulation of warfare that's necessary, what to do with captives. So there's no doubt that the messenger becomes the central figure, I think. I think you could say in the first part of the Quran, in a sense, God is more central, but in the second part, the messenger becomes the mediator of God. Muslims wouldn't like you to say that, and they don't, Islam doesn't want you to call Muhammad the guide. It's Allah is the guide, but actually he does become this messenger figure does become a personal guide, and yeah, it's a big shift. In a way, I think it's like a huge psychological crisis happens of almost failing. The Quran describes the messenger as very anxious and depressed, and it gets resolved, but there's a price to pay, and the part of the price is, I think, what happens to the messenger and how he sees his role, and that's quite damaging. And then he becomes the best example. So instead of just being a messenger who delivers a message, he becomes the model for every Muslim to follow, and that gets promoted it's actually in the second part of the Quran that gets really promoted. He's the best example, and that out of that projects this whole idea that the way for a Muslim to live is to live like Muhammad and emulate his every word and deed, and how he dressed and how he acted in every aspect of his life. So that emerges from this theological crisis, I think.
Well, thanks for that detailed answer. Questions are coming in, so I'm going to get started. The very first question I have here for you is, why did Quran take 150 years to be written, since the Arabs were conquering around literate people?
I think they were too busy conquering. They had vast, conquests, and so that's the view I've always taken. another possibility is that they were still working out the answers, that it took some time to work out how to fit the Quran into what was happening with the Arab state. But yeah, they were on horseback for quite a while.
I will read you the next question mainly. I mean, I wasn't planning to dismiss it, but they took a guess. I will dismiss this question. Who are the ones doing the critical investigation? Anti-Muslims, or are any Muslims involved? Before you answer that, if you don't mind me just putting an insert, anyone, whoever put that question is, please note that this program is not an anti-Muslim program. This is an education on Islam and Quran program. But go ahead, Mark, answer's yours.
Yes, there are some Muslims who are involved in reconsidering some of these things. And Walid Saleh is an example. He's in Canada, and he has written some articles making similar points to the ones I've made about this crisis in the Quranic community. However, there are lots of Muslims who would find this sort of investigation difficult for theological reasons. I think it's not just Western scholars, that's for sure. There's also lots of former Muslims who have a critical view towards the Quran. I mean, I think it's important to approach these sorts of questions from as objective a view, as perspective as possible, and not to let polemics drive the research. It's important to keep an open mind and pay attention to the evidence. Unfortunately, often Islamic studies by Western scholars has been limited by too great a dependence on the traditional explanations.
Understandable. The next question is, was the violence at that time similar to the jihad today?
If you go on the Quran, there's not a lot of detail about the violence. I mean, there's descriptions of battles. So I think there's no doubt that the violence today is inspired by the Quranic account and also the backstory, the Muslim backstory. So the beheadings, for example, is something that is mentioned quite a lot in the Quran, cutting the throats. So there's some patterns that copy over. I think also there are theological similarities. ISIS saw its violence and sees its violence as a kind of anticipation of hell. It's bringing the judgment of God upon people. And that, I think, helped them feel less responsible personally, because they were just doing what God would want them to do and what they believed will happen anyway to people when they go to hell. So yeah, there's no doubt that the violence that's described in the Quran and as interpreted, it has driven a lot of has shaped a lot of Islamic violence, yes. And I think that's a result of conscientious and careful examination by Muslim scholars down the centuries as well, who sought to copy and follow in the footsteps of Muhammad.
Agreed. Next question says, in the past, Muslim scholars had not been willing to accept questioning of their history, truth, and of the Quran. Is this changing? Will it be mainly seen as non-Muslim criticizing, daring to question the unquestionable, or are Muslim scholars entering into dialogue? Is it opening things up, or is there a backlash and a closing down?
Well, I think all of that is true. And in fact, for decades, there have been Muslims questioning the official story. Ali Dashti was an Iranian intellectual who wrote about Muhammad, engaged with his story in a critical way. I think others have also, people have lost their lives for asking questions. I think that the momentum of questioning is increasing all the time and has been, it will continue to do so. There is a principle in Islamic jurisprudence in the Sharia that a Muslim should find someone who knows more than they do and follow their advice. And if you follow them faithfully, you're excused from not knowing everything. You don't have to have every answer yourself. So there's a tendency, I think, in Islamic scholarship to submit to the opinion of somebody else. And it's very interesting. There's some ferment going on now amongst against Muslims for engaging with Western critique about the problem of the many manuscripts of the Quran, the different versions of the Quran, which ordinary Muslims are just often not aware of. And Yasser Qadri, who's a scholar who's engaging with this issue recently, just on a YouTube video on June the 8th, he said, look, you know, you taught these things and you just accept it. But he said, nevertheless, I was troubled to understand these issues. So he mentions both the reality of wanting to be submissive and just accept what your teachers say, but also the challenge of integrating it intellectually. And I think that's the story of the Muslim world, really, to try and resolve that. And I do think that traditional Islamic view that you should just accept what you're told and not ask questions, which permeates the culture. It's not just a religious position, it becomes a cultural approach to everything, really. That's becoming increasingly unsustainable. And I mean, I've met many hundreds of Iranians, and most of them hate that culture. They don't want to be like, they want to ask questions, they want to form their own views, make their own choices. And so, yeah, it's not easy. People are suffering, and Islam's under a lot of pressure, I would think, around these issues.
Wonderful. Next question actually asked, how many Qurans, how many versions of Qurans are there?
That's a complicated question. There's a tradition that says that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad in a variety of different forms or dialects. Then there was standardization under a caliph, supposedly getting rid of all the variation, but then there were further variants depending on the lettering and how you point it. And so it's a whole science in Islam of dealing with these variants. So scores of different Qurans. Then you have the evidence of all the ancient manuscripts, which will vary as well. And there are thousands of corrections on the pages as well. So which is the true Quran, the corrected variant or the one that was written first? And so, yeah, that whole area of the text critical study of the Quran is just in its infancy. I mean, it's where we were 500 or 600 years ago with the Bible, I think. And that's a really important area that needs to be developed a lot more. So that could be a whole talk in itself.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to insert my own question following up on that question. If there is no actual concrete agreement, at least, just within Quran, which Quran is real or which translation is proper or any of that, then how is this so-called religion growing so fast? Which version is growing? Does that question make sense? Like, where is the concrete evidence of Islam even existing? Which one is the truth one?
Well,
the hijacked one.
Well, you know, people choose their religion not just based on evidence or on scientific logic or whatever. They make spiritual choices based on social and personal issues. A lot of the growth of Islam has been biological, although that's kind of being challenged in Iran, for example, with many young people wanting to leave Islam. And there's also some of the evangelistic efforts in the West are successful because of the collapse of Western civilization, I think, and people looking for certainty that Islam offers. So there's a really complex set of stories. I think with regard to the variations between the different manuscripts of the Quran, Muslim scholars, I mean, a pious Muslim would say that most of those variations are not that significant for theology. I don't think that's completely true, but you know, a lot of them are quite detailed variations. And the point is not that there's a completely different meaning in the different Qurans, but that it's not the case that we have just one Quran. And one of the problems is the Quran says that it's perfectly preserved. So it's a theological claim the Quran itself makes. And often when the Quran makes these theological claims, they get embedded in the community and it shapes the way the community thinks about the evidence. So the Muslim community's never really been able to deal very well with I think, with the variations in the manuscripts that exist in every human manuscript that's copied, by the way. The Quran's not unique. So yeah, I don't see that there's these sorts of concerns about the validity of the claim, for example, that the Quran is perfectly preserved, these will have an effect on Muslims. But it takes quite a long time for ideas like this to filter down and for people to reconsider their worldview, and educated people will have a different response to, say, simple village people too as well.
Wonderful. Next question says, why is Muhammad's night fight to the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem, given so much importance?
Well, you know, it doesn't say Jerusalem in the Quran or in the Hadiths or any of the early Islamic traditions. People will sometimes tell you the direction of prayer was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca, but actually it never says Jerusalem. It says Sham, changed from Syria to Mecca. So there is nothing in the Hadiths or the Quran to link that mentions Jerusalem. And that story that the farthest mosque or this mosque that was involved in the night journey was Jerusalem, that connection was made later. And why did it happen? Well, I think you look at the Dome of the Rock and you see those inscriptions around the inside of the building that basically are negating Christianity, and it's a political location that building was put there as a physical sign of the dominance of Islam over Christianity and its replacement. So Jerusalem is important for theological reasons. It's a claim of replacement. You know, Islam claims to be the original Christianity and the original Judaism. It claims to be the true expression of Judaism. So to take that, you know, so Solomon was a Muslim, and Moses was a Muslim, and David was a Muslim according to Islam. So that implies that if Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem, it was a mosque, and Jerusalem is an Islamic heritage and it needs to be claimed. So I think my best understanding is that Jerusalem got attached to that night journey story for political and theological reasons. And here we are today.
Okay, we are almost out of time. Most of the questions were repeated question, but one question that was also repeated, which will be our last question, is they say Allah or God of Islam is not the same as Allah as God of Christianity. Some say they are. Which one is the real God? Or is it the same God?
Well, as a Christian, I think there's only one God, you know, and the Creator. And you could say Muslims and Christians both worship the Creator, and they both believe that there's one God. So that would sort of imply they're the same. And I know in everyday conversations with Muslims, I would not make an issue of this. But to be realistic, I think the Quran describes God in very different terms. So the God of the Quran has very different attributes from the God of the Bible. I think I've written a whole book on that. Which God? And the differences in attributes are really important to do with faithfulness, relationship, connection with human beings, the holiness of God, you know, to do with the source of evil and goodness. And these are really deep and important differences. So I would say, from a theological point of view, it's a different God, different image of God, different personality of God, a different worship. And when you speak about worship, you know, you worship God not just as an object, as an entity, but as someone with attributes, with a you know, who stands in relationship to you in a particular way. And so I think it's, in a sense, Muslims and Christians in that sense do worship a different God. But I want to just make one final point, that many Muslims have a sense of God and who God should be that they don't get from their religion. They get from their conscience, their awareness of a Creator. And so I've met so many people who've left Islam or thought about leaving Islam, and they've said something like, you know, I believe in God, but I don't recognize the God I believe in my experience of Islam and what is happening there. So I think, you know, if you're speaking about a pious Muslim who's just worshipping God in their own way, they might be worshipping the God that their heart tells them God ought to be, and it might not be the same thing as what the religion says. One of my friends who was an Aussie and became a Salafi Muslim and then left Islam, he said, you know, we used to often teach people to act against their conscience. And I think that awareness of God is a universal characteristic of the human spirit. But no, fundamentally different God, and I have a few books about that as well.
Agreed. And if you don't mind me saying, as an ex-Muslim Christian now, I can tell you personally from my experience, If it's the definition or personality or however you put it, definitely God of Islam has very, very, very bad relationship with women and girls. So I'm very happy to be saved by the God of Christianity. With that being said, Mark, would you please tell our audience where can they get your book and where do they go to just follow your work and get more education?
Sure. If you go to markdury.com, it's got a link to my articles and you can subscribe to posts and also links to books as well. But if you go to Amazon and Google, say, Amazon Dury, my books will come up. And as I said, the Quran and its biblical reflexes, which is for me the completion of 20 years of work, was hardback, was $120, but it's now about $40 in the US on Amazon, so it's more affordable, and you'll find it there.
Absolutely, everyone go to markdury.com and keep on getting educated on this topic, as Mark, I'm sure, will put more information on his website. Mark, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And to our audience, those of you who have stayed with us and watched this program, thank you so much. Remember, all of these webinars are brought to you for free by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glasgow Gang. So if you want to support this project, go to frontpagemag.com and consider making a 100% tax deductible donation. Until the next time, stay safe. Goodbye.